June 1944, a robotic buzz saw drones over the rooftops of London. No pilot, no mercy. Just 850 kilograms of explosive on a countdown. Britain's fastest fighter scrambled to stop it, but bullets alone aren't enough. One pilot will have to fly wingtip to wingtip with a bomb and flip it out of the sky with his bare wing. This is the story of the Hawker Tempest, the piston engine killer built in desperation, that ended up hunting the future itself. Part 1. The Sound Before the Silence. There is a particular sound that the people of southern England learned to fear in the summer of 1944. It wasn't the wail of an air raid siren, though that came too. It wasn't the drone of a bomber formation, deep and rolling, the kind Londoners had grown almost used to during the Blitz years earlier. This was something new, something mechanical, flat and relentless, a harsh, buzzing rasp, like a two-stroke engine dragged across the sky by an invisible hand. People began calling it, with the dark humor the British reserve for their worst moments, the buzz bomb. Its true name was the V1, Vergeltungswaffe 1, Vengeance Weapon 1, and it was unlike anything an air defense system had ever been built to stop. Here is the detail that made it so terrifying. The sound was not the danger. As long as you could hear that pulse jet engine rasping overhead, you were, statistically, safe. The horror began the instant the buzzing stopped. Silence meant the fuel had run out, the engine had cut, and the 1,500-pound warhead riding beneath those stubby wings had begun its final glide toward the earth, toward someone's rooftop, someone's street, someone's kitchen table. Families in Kent and the outskirts of London would freeze mid-conversation at the sudden quiet, count the seconds, and pray the silence belonged to somebody else's neighborhood. By the time this campaign began in earnest, Britain and her allies were already deep into what should have been a season of triumph. The date was 1944, moving toward 1945, the closing chapters of the Second World War. 03. Weeks earlier, the largest amphibious invasion in human history had stormed the beaches of Normandy. D-Day had cracked open Hitler's fortress Europe, and Allied armies were grinding eastward through French hedgerows, liberating towns one bloody mile at a time. 1613. On every map in every situation room from London to Washington, the arrows all pointed toward Berlin. Victory, for the first time in years, felt inevitable. But Nazi Germany, cornered and bleeding, was not finished innovating. As conventional defeat closed in from the west, and the Soviets advanced from the east, German engineers turned to something that had never before existed on any battlefield. Weapons that didn't need a pilot, and weapons that didn't need a propeller at all. The V1 flying bomb was the first shock, an unmanned aircraft, launched from ramps along the French and Dutch coasts, aimed with crude but effective guidance systems directly at London. 52. It required no human being to fly it to its target, and that alone made it a nightmare for air defense planners who had spent 5 years building a system designed to shoot down men, not machines. And that was only the beginning. Waiting in the wings, almost literally, were aircraft that would make every propeller-driven fighter on Earth look like it belonged to a previous era of warfare. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, and the Arado R-234, the first jet bomber ever to see combat. 2545. Germany, even as it lost the war on the ground, was racing to win it in the air, with technology that the Allies hadn't even finished designing on paper. Into this narrow, chaotic window of history, a hinge point where propeller aircraft and jet aircraft briefly shared the same sky, flew a machine that history books rarely give its due. Not the Spitfire immortalized in 1,000 films. Not the Mustang, America's long-range escort legend. This is the story of the Hawker Tempest, a fighter born from failure, engineered in desperation, and thrown into 3 completely different wars within the span of a single year. A defensive war against robot bombs, a savage low-level war against German railways and roads, and finally, an almost mythic duel against the jets that were supposed to make it obsolete. Part 2. Born from a killer's mistakes, to understand why the Tempest existed at all, you first have to understand the aircraft it was built to fix. And fix is a word chosen carefully, because its predecessor wasn't just flawed. It was, in certain configurations, lethal to its own pilots. The Hawker Typhoon entered RAF service as a big, brutish, powerful fighter, packed with a colossal engine and heavy cannon armament. On paper, it looked like exactly what Fighter Command needed. In the air, it revealed a series of terrifying design flaws. Its wing was thick, far thicker than aerodynamic theory of the era, wanted for a high-speed fighter, and that thickness generated enormous drag as the aircraft approached its top speed, robbing it of the very performance it was designed to deliver 9/16. Worse, the Typhoon suffered from violent structural vibration at certain speeds, a shuddering that rattled through the airframe and, in a horrifying number of documented cases, caused the tail section to separate from the fuselage entirely. Mid-flight 09/16. Pilots died, not in combat, not to enemy fire, but to their own aircraft tearing itself apart around them. Squadrons that flew the Typhoon lived with a kind of dread that had nothing to do with the Luftwaffe. Hawker's chief designer, a man named Sidney Cam, was not the type to abandon a promising airframe simply because its first iteration had gone catastrophically wrong. Cam had already built a reputation as one of the era's great aeronautical problem solvers, and he approached the Typhoon's failures the way a surgeon approaches a diagnosis. Identify the disease. Don't just treat the symptoms. The redesign that emerged was, in almost every meaningful sense, a new aircraft wearing a familiar name. Cam's team threw out the thick, draggy wing and replaced it with something radically thinner. A laminar flow-inspired profile that sliced through the air with a fraction of the resistance 10/58. They lengthened the fuselage, stretching the aircraft's proportions to improve stability and reduce the violent vibration that had doomed so many Typhoon pilots 13/22, and they married this new airframe to an absolute monster of a power plant. The Napier Sabre II, a liquid-cooled, sleeve-valve H-24 engine capable of producing roughly 420 horsepower, a genuinely staggering figure for a single-engine fighter of that era 13/04. The result was named the Tempest. Its first true combat variant, the Tempest Mark V, reached frontline squadrons and immediately proved that Cam's gamble had paid off. 12/33. Where the Typhoon had been a flawed brute, the Tempest was something closer to a scalpel, still enormously powerful, but finally controllably fast. At low altitude, where most of its combat career would actually take place, it was arguably the fastest piston-engine fighter in the entire European theater. And that raw speed, more than any single statistic on a spec sheet, is what would make the Tempest the answer to a problem nobody had even known they'd have to solve a year earlier. How do you catch a bomb that flies faster than most fighters can climb? Part 3. The Hunt for the Buzz Bombs. When the V-1 campaign against London began in the summer of 1944, Fighter Command scrambled to assemble a defense that had never before been attempted: an integrated system of radar, anti-aircraft guns, barrage balloons, and fighters, all working together against a target that had no pilot to demoralize, no fuel gauge to worry about running dry from fear, and no instinct for self-preservation whatsoever. You couldn't scare a V-1. You could only destroy it, deflect it, or let it land somewhere less deadly than a city center. The Tempest squadrons, originally earmarked for the air battles unfolding over France in support of the Normandy campaign, were abruptly pulled back to home defense duties in England 2/19. It was, in its own way, an admission from RAF Command of exactly how serious the buzz bomb threat had become, pulling frontline fighters away from the main offensive to defend the capital against an unmanned menace. And the Tempest turned out to be, almost providentially, the single best tool for the job that the Allies possessed. The V-1 cruised at somewhere between 340 and 400 miles per hour at low to medium altitude, fast enough that many contemporary Allied fighters simply couldn't catch it in level flight, no matter how skilled the pilot at the controls. The Tempest, with its thin wing and monstrous saber engine, could 157. At low altitude specifically, exactly the regime where the V-1 flew, the Tempest was among the very fastest aircraft in the entire war, propeller or otherwise. Suddenly, RAF pilots had a machine that could actually run down a flying bomb in a tail chase, rather than watching helplessly as it droned past, untouchable, toward London. But catching the thing was only half the problem. Shooting it down safely was an entirely different kind of nightmare. Consider the physics of the situation a Tempest pilot faced. To reliably destroy a V-1 with cannon fire, pilots typically had to close to somewhere between 150 and 200 yards, a gut-wrenchingly short distance when your target is carrying nearly a ton of high-explosive 06. 29. Get the range wrong, misjudge the geometry even slightly, and the resulting detonation could catch your own aircraft in the blast radius, shredding wings and canopies that had survived 100 less reckless encounters with the enemy. Pilots described the tension of that final approach, throttle open, cannon selector armed, watching the stubby little bomb grow larger and larger in the gun sight, knowing that pulling the trigger too late or too close could turn their own fighter into a second fireball in the sky. And then there was the other method, the one that sounds almost too audacious to be true, except that it was standard enough practice to become a documented RAF tactic. Some Tempest pilots, either out of ammunition or simply unwilling to risk a point-blank cannon burst, developed a technique of flying their wingtip directly beneath the wing of the V-1 itself. By easing their own wing up against the underside of the bomb's wing, carefully, precisely, at closing speeds approaching 400 miles an hour, a pilot could disrupt the airflow enough to tip the V-1's wing, sending it into an uncontrolled roll 645. The V-1's primitive autopilot, never designed to handle sudden aerodynamic disruption, would lose its ability to maintain stable, level flight. The bomb would tumble out of the sky and detonate harmlessly in a field, a forest, open water, anywhere but the crowded streets it had been aimed at. Think about what that maneuver actually demanded of a human being. No parachute for the bomb, no ejection seat for a mistake, just two aircraft, one flown by a person, one flown by nothing at all, inches apart at nearly full throttle, and a pilot deliberately choosing to touch wings with a flying bomb rather than let it reach a city full of civilians. The results of this campaign, when tallied, are almost staggering in their specificity. Tempest squadrons were credited with destroying 638 V-1 flying bombs over the course of the campaign, representing roughly 34% of every single V-1 shot down by RAF fighters during the entire defense of London 8.05. One aircraft type, flown by a relatively small number of squadrons, accounted for more than a third of the RAF's entire aerial kill total against an enemy that had no pilot to outfly, no morale to break, only raw performance to outfly and raw nerve to outfight. Part 4. From Sky Hunter to Ground Hunter. By late 1944, the V-1 threat against London began to subside, partly because Allied ground forces were overrunning the launch sites in northern France and the Low Countries, and partly because Germany was shifting its vengeance weapon strategy toward the V-2 rocket, a threat no propeller fighter on Earth could intercept, since it arrived from the edge of space faster than sound itself. With the skies over England growing quieter, the Tempest squadrons that had spent months defending London were sent back across the Channel, back to the war they had originally been built for 1742. But the mission, waiting for them in continental Europe, was almost the opposite of what they'd been doing over England. Instead of chasing a single fast target in open sky, Tempest pilots now flew what the RAF called armed reconnaissance, low-level sweeps over German-held territory, hunting not aircraft but the sinews of the entire German war machine, locomotives, freight trains, fuel trucks, staff cars, barges, and the rail lines that tied it all together. 1811. The Tempest was, once again, almost perfectly suited to the job it was handed. Its armament, 4 Hispano 20mm cannons mounted in the wings, delivered a weight of fire capable of shredding a locomotive's boiler, setting a fuel truck ablaze, or tearing through the thin armor of a half-track in a single firing pass. 11. Roaming low over French, Belgian, and German roads and railways, Tempest pilots became the nightmare of any German unit trying to move supplies, reinforcements, or fuel toward a crumbling front line. Every train that didn't arrive, every convoy that never reached its destination, was one more crack in an already failing war machine. This kind of warfare, though, extracted its own brutal price. Flying at treetop height, at several hundred miles an hour, over territory bristling with German anti-aircraft defenses, meant that Tempest pilots were operating inside what amounted to a kill zone at every single moment of the mission. The German flak network, light and medium anti-aircraft guns positioned along rail lines, road junctions, and troop concentrations specifically because they anticipated exactly this kind of low-level attack, inflicted serious, sustained losses on Tempest squadrons throughout this phase of the campaign. 7. There was no altitude to trade for time, no room to dive away from a lucky burst of fire. A single well-placed round of light flak, striking a coolant line or a control cable at treetop height, gave a pilot seconds, not minutes, to find anywhere safe to put the aircraft down, and anywhere safe was, by definition, deep inside enemy territory. It's a sobering counterpoint to the more romantic image of high-speed aerial dogfighting. Some of the Tempest's most dangerous, most costly missions weren't against other aircraft at all. They were flown against gun crews on the ground, men whose entire job was to watch the sky and wait. Port 5. Master of the low sky. When Tempests did meet German fighters in the air during this final chapter of the war, the results tilted overwhelmingly in their favor, at least against one specific category of opponent. Against the Luftwaffe's remaining piston engine fighters, chiefly the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190, the Tempest proved to be a genuinely dominant aircraft, particularly at low and medium altitude, where its thin wing speed advantage mattered most. 23. Combat records from this period credit Tempest squadrons with an extraordinary kill ratio against these opponents. Roughly 8 victories for every Tempest lost in these particular engagements. 23. That number deserves a moment of context, because by 1944 and 1945, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was a shell of what it had been earlier in the war. Fuel shortages meant Germans received a fraction of the flight training hours that their predecessors had gotten just a few years earlier. Experienced instructors and veteran squadron leaders had been steadily killed off in years of relentless attrition on multiple fronts. Still, an 8-to-1 kill ratio against frontline German fighter types, aircraft that had once ruled the skies of Europe, is a remarkable testament to just how far Sidney Cam's redesign had transformed the failed Typhoon into a genuinely superior low-altitude fighting machine. At the altitudes where most of the war's final air battles were actually being fought, not the high-altitude bomber escort duels of earlier years, but the desperate, chaotic, low-level scramble of the war's last months. The Tempest simply outclassed almost everything Germany could still put into the air with a propeller on the front. Almost everything, because Germany, by this point in the war, had stopped relying exclusively on propellers. Port 6. The hunter becomes the hunted, and then the hunter again. Nothing in the history of aerial warfare prepared pilots, Allied or German, for what it felt like the first time a jet aircraft crossed their gun sight. Imagine flying your fastest piston fighter, an aircraft that has just spent months dominating every propeller-driven opponent you've faced, and watching something streak past you at a speed your own engine simply cannot produce, trailing a strange, high-pitched whine instead of the throaty roar every pilot had grown up associating with aircraft engines. No propeller, no obvious means of propulsion at all, to eyes that had never seen a jet before. Just raw, terrifying speed. By early 1945, in the war's final months, Tempest pilots began encountering exactly this. The Messerschmitt Me 262 and the Arado R-234, the world's first operational jet fighter and jet bomber respectively 25. 45. These aircraft weren't marginally faster than anything flying with a propeller. They were faster by a margin that made conventional dogfighting tactics almost meaningless. A Tempest pilot who found himself behind an Me-262 in level flight had no realistic hope of closing the distance through speed alone. The jet would simply extend away, accelerating out of gun range before a shot could even be lined up. And yet, remarkably, tellingly, German jet pilots who flew and fought against the Tempest during this period came away with a distinct and specific respect for it. Multiple German aviators who encountered Tempests in combat later described it as the single most dangerous piston engine opponent they faced in the entire war. 26. 28. That is an extraordinary statement coming from men who were, technically, flying the most advanced fighter aircraft on the planet. It tells you something about just how far the Tempest had come from the doomed, tail-shedding Typhoon it had been born from only a couple of years earlier. Because ARAF pilots, faced with an opponent they could not outrun, did what skilled tacticians throughout history have always done when technology alone couldn't win the fight. They attacked the enemy's vulnerabilities instead of his strengths. Jet engines of this pioneering era, primitive by any later standard, were extraordinarily fragile during two specific phases of flight: takeoff, when the engines were spooling from idle and acceleration was sluggish, and especially landing, when a jet had to bleed off its tremendous speed advantage and approach its airfield slow, low and vulnerable, exactly like any other aircraft. RAF squadrons developed and refined a tactic that pilots grimly nicknamed Rat Scramble. 2644. Tempests would loiter, patient and predatory, near known Me-262 airfields, not hunting the jets in the open sky where speed made them untouchable, but waiting for the precise moment when a jet, low on fuel after a mission, was forced to slow down and commit to its landing approach. In that brief window, engines throttled back, altitude low, speed reduced to something a Tempest could actually match, the jet's overwhelming advantage evaporated completely. A fighter that could outrun anything in the sky became, for perhaps 90 seconds, just as vulnerable as any other aircraft on final approach. And Tempest pilots waiting in ambush made those 90 seconds count. It is one of the more darkly elegant ironies of the entire war, the future of aviation, embodied in the world's first jet fighters, being hunted down not by superior technology, but by superior patience, by pilots flying an aircraft descended from a design so flawed it used to kill its own pilots through structural failure alone. Part 7. The Last Great Piston Fighter. The Second World War ended in Europe in May 1945, and with it ended the Tempest's brief, blazing combat career. A career that had spanned barely a year, but had asked the aircraft to fill three, almost entirely different roles: interceptor of unmanned robot bombs, low-level ground attack raider, and finally, jet hunter, stalking the very technology that was about to make its entire category of aircraft obsolete. In the immediate post-war period, the Tempest briefly held a position of real prestige. For a time, it was actually selected as a standard frontline fighter type for the Royal Air Force, a recognition of just how thoroughly Sidney Cam's redesign had succeeded. 29.5. But history moves quickly after major wars, and aviation history in the late 1940s moved faster than almost any other. The very jets the Tempest had spent its final combat months hunting represented an irreversible technological shift. Within a few short years, the Tempest, for all its speed, for all its combat record, for all the respect it had earned from friend and enemy alike, was retired from frontline service, quietly superseded by a new generation of RAF jets, the Gloucester Meteor and the de Havilland Vampire, aircraft that didn't need to ambush jets on landing approach because they were jets themselves. 29. So 5. It is tempting, looking back from the present, to treat the Tempest as a footnote, a transitional aircraft, sandwiched awkwardly between the piston engine legends of the war's early years and the jet age that followed almost immediately after. But that framing misses what actually made the Tempest remarkable. It wasn't merely fast, it was the aircraft called upon, in the space of less than 12 months, to solve 3 completely different tactical problems that no other single fighter type in the war was asked to solve. Catch an unmanned robot bomb, traveling at nearly 400 miles an hour. Survive sustained low-level strafing runs against a heavily defended enemy transport network. And finally, outthink, because it certainly couldn't outrun, the most advanced fighter aircraft the world had yet produced. Consider, too, the strange symmetry at the heart of the Tempest's story. It began its life as a rescue mission, an attempt to save a fundamentally dangerous aircraft, the Typhoon, from its own fatal design flaws. It ended its combat career as a rescue mission of an entirely different kind, a machine racing against silence, then explosion over London, and later racing against runways full of jets that represented the literal future of flight. In between, it flew low over burning rail yards, absorbing flak that most fighters were never asked to survive. The Hawker Tempest never received the post-war mythology of the Spitfire, never became the subject of the countless films and novels that immortalized the Mustang. It flew for too short a window, in too narrow and specialized a set of roles, to capture the public imagination the way its more famous cousins did. But for the pilots who flew it against V-1 bombs at point-blank range, for the ground crews who patched flak damage after low-level rail attacks, and, perhaps most tellingly of all, for the German jet pilots who called it the most dangerous propeller aircraft they ever faced, the Tempest's legacy needs no embellishment. It stands, quite simply, as one of the finest fighters ever built around a piston engine, arriving at the very last possible moment in aviation history, when a piston engine could still matter, doing everything that was asked of it, and then stepping aside, its work finished, as the jet age it had helped delay finally, inevitably, arrived 2929. Part 8. Inside the cockpit. What it actually felt like. Statistics and kill ratios tell you what the Tempest accomplished. They tell you almost nothing about what it demanded from the men strapped into its cockpit, hour after hour, mission after mission. To really understand this aircraft, you have to imagine sitting where its pilots sat. Picture the startup sequence alone. The Napier Sabre engine was not a smooth, docile machine. It was a temperamental, sleeve valve monster, 24 cylinders, arranged in an H-block configuration, that no other production fighter engine in the war quite matched. 13. Faux 4. Starting it was a small ritual of its own. Priming the cylinders, watching oil pressure gauges creep upward, listening for that engine to catch, cough, and finally settle into a deep, buzzing snarl that pilots said they could feel through the airframe before they ever left the ground. Once it caught, 2 420 horsepower sat directly in front of you, restrained only by throttle position and your own right hand. Takeoff in a Tempest was an exercise in managing torque. That much power, driving a single enormous propeller, wanted to swing the nose hard to one side the instant the throttle opened. Pilots learned to compensate almost instinctively. Rudder pressure building in careful coordination with throttle advance, the tail coming up, the aircraft accelerating down the runway with a violence that pinned you back into the seat in a way lighter fighters simply couldn't replicate. And then airborne, the transformation. An aircraft that felt brutish and heavy on the ground suddenly turned light, responsive, almost eager, once it had speed and altitude to work with. Now imagine flying that aircraft at treetop height, at 400 miles an hour, chasing something that couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be intimidated, couldn't make a mistake out of fear the way a human pilot might. The V-1 didn't jink, didn't dive for cover, didn't try to escape into cloud. It flew a straight, predictable line at a constant altitude and constant speed, which sounds like it should make the intercept easier, until you remember that predictability cuts both ways. A V-1 pilot, if you can even use that word for an unmanned weapon, never got scared and pulled away from a bad firing position. It just kept coming, straight and level, whether you were lined up correctly or not, whether your closing rate put you inside its blast radius or not. Veterans of the V-1 patrols described the strange psychological weight of chasing something with no human being inside it. There was no satisfaction of outflying an opponent, no sense of having won a duel of skill against another pilot's judgment. There was only math, closing speed, range, angle, and the brutal countdown of how many seconds remained before either your cannon shells found the warhead, or the geometry ran out, and the bomb sailed past you toward a city full of people who had no idea it was coming. Pilots flew these intercepts sometimes multiple times in a single day, day after day. An exhausting rhythm of scramble, climb, chase, fire, return, refuel, scramble again. A kind of combat that offered almost none of the psychological breathing room that even the worst dogfights against human opponents at least provided. And then there was the wing-tipping maneuver. Arguably, one of the most nerve-shredding techniques employed by any Allied pilots in the entire war. 06. 45. Understand what was actually being asked here. Closing to within feet of an armed explosive device, traveling at nearly 400 miles an hour. Easing your own wingtip beneath its wing with a precision that left almost no margin for error, and then applying exactly the right amount of aerodynamic disruption to tip it into an uncontrollable roll. All while maintaining enough separation that the resulting crash and detonation, seconds later, wouldn't catch your own aircraft in its blast radius. Too timid, and nothing happened. The bomb continued on its way. Too aggressive, and you risked a mid-air collision with a live warhead. It was flying that demanded the touch of a surgeon, executed at the speed of a sprinter, and pilots who mastered it did so through repetition, nerve, and, by their own later accounts, no small amount of luck holding out over dozens of attempts. Part 9. The machine itself. A closer look. It's worth pausing the narrative to appreciate just how radical an engineering achievement the Tempest actually represented, especially set against the aircraft it replaced. The wing redesign alone deserves more attention than it usually gets. Sidney Cam's team didn't simply thin out the Typhoon's existing wing. They essentially designed a new airfoil from first principles, chasing the kind of low-drag, high-speed performance that would later become associated with laminar flow wing designs. 10. 58. At the speeds the Tempest was capable of reaching in a dive or a low-altitude sprint, every fraction of a percentage point of drag reduction translated directly into extra miles per hour. And extra miles per hour was the single currency that mattered most. Whether you were chasing a V1 or trying to survive an encounter with an Me-262, the fuselage stretch is another detail that rewards a closer look. 13. 22. Aircraft designers of the era understood, sometimes through hard experience, that a longer fuselage generally improved yaw stability, the aircraft's tendency to track straight and resist unwanted side-to-side wandering, especially at high speed. The Typhoon's shorter, stubbier fuselage had been part of what made it prone to violent buffeting and, in the worst cases, structural failure at the tail. By lengthening the airframe, Cam's team gave the Tempest a fundamentally more stable platform, one that could handle high-speed maneuvering, sustain diving attacks, and the kind of low-altitude turbulence that came with flying at treetop height without shaking itself apart. Then there's the armament. 4 Hispano Mark II 20mm cannons, mounted in the wings, delivering a devastating weight of fire per second compared to the smaller caliber machine guns still standard on many contemporary fighters. 18. 11. 20mm cannon shells didn't just punch holes in enemy aircraft or vehicles. They carried explosive charges capable of detonating on impact, turning even a glancing hit on a locomotive boiler, a fuel truck, or an enemy aircraft's wing root into a potentially catastrophic failure. This was precisely the kind of firepower needed both to reliably destroy a V-1's warhead-laden airframe at range and to tear apart the German transport network. The Tempest spent its final war months attacking. Put all of this together, the low-drag wing, the stabilized fuselage, the monstrous Sabre engine, and the devastating cannon armament, and you understand why the Tempest wasn't simply a slightly improved Typhoon. It was, functionally, a different aircraft that happened to share some structural DNA with its troubled predecessor, purpose-built for a kind of warfare that hadn't even fully existed when the Typhoon was originally designed. Part 10. The other side of the fight war history, told only from one side, is always incomplete. It's worth remembering that every V1 the Tempest destroyed represented a German engineering and industrial effort, factories, launch crews, and a strategic bet by the Nazi High Command that unmanned weapons could achieve what the Luftwaffe's dwindling bomber force could no longer accomplish: sustained, demoralizing attacks on London without risking German aircrew. The V1 campaign was, from Germany's perspective, a rational response to a losing air war. A way to keep striking at Britain even after years of attrition had gutted the Luftwaffe's ability to mount traditional bombing raids. That it failed to break British morale, and that aircraft like the Tempest played a direct role in blunting its effectiveness, doesn't erase how seriously German planners believed in the weapon, nor how much material and manpower they poured into the launch sites the Allies spent months bombing and eventually overrunning. Similarly, the jet pilots who faced Tempests in the war's final weeks were, for the most part, flying at the absolute technological forefront of 1945 aviation while their own war was visibly, undeniably collapsing around them. Fuel shortages were so severe by this point that many Me-262 sorties were flown on improvised or synthetic fuel blends. Airfields were under near-constant threat from roaming Allied fighter bombers, Tempests very much included, which meant that simply taking off or landing a jet had become one of the most dangerous parts of any mission, quite apart from anything that happened once airborne 26-44. That German pilots, under those brutal circumstances, still came away describing the Tempest specifically as their most dangerous piston-engine opponent. 26-28 says something important about the aircraft's genuine performance. This wasn't propaganda or wartime bravado, but a professional assessment from men who had every reason, given what they were flying, to dismiss propeller fighters as yesterday's technology. Part 11. Why this story still matters. There's a reason stories like the Tempests continue to resonate, decades after the guns fell silent. It isn't nostalgia for war itself. It's something closer to fascination with what human ingenuity looks like under maximum pressure. In less than 2 years, engineers took a fundamentally dangerous, failing aircraft and transformed it into arguably the finest low-altitude piston fighter of the entire war. Pilots took an aircraft never originally designed to intercept unmanned weapons and adapted their tactics, including maneuvers as audacious as tipping a live bomb out of the sky with a wingtip, to meet a threat nobody had trained them for. And when faced with an enemy flying genuinely superior technology in the form of early jet fighters, those same pilots didn't simply concede the fight. They found the one tactical window, takeoff and landing, where speed didn't matter, and they exploited it with ruthless patience. That's the through line connecting every chapter of the Tempest's short combat career. Adaptation under pressure, again and again, against threats that changed faster than doctrine could keep up with. A fighter forced to become an interceptor, then a ground attack raider, then a jet hunter, all within about 12 months. That's not a story about one great aircraft, so much as it's a story about the people who kept finding new ways to make an aging technology matter, right up until the very last chapter of a war that changed aviation forever. The Spitfire will always be the symbol most people picture when they think of British fighters in the Second World War. But if you want to understand what it actually took to survive the war's final, strangest year, a year of robot bombs and jet engines, of silence that meant death and speed that meant survival, the Hawker Tempest, and the pilots who flew it, tell that story better than almost any other aircraft in the entire conflict.